The concierge's face went pale as she scrolled through her computer screen. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Chen, but it appears there's been a situation with your honeymoon reservation. My new husband, David, squeezed my hand as we stood in the marble lobby of the Serenity Bay Resort, our luggage still damp from the tropical rain outside. We'd just spent 14 hours traveling to this remote island in the Maldives, the same resort where we'd had our first romantic getaway 2 years ago, the place where David had proposed on the beach at sunset. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What kind of situation? David asked, though I could see the dread already creeping into his expression. Well, sir, it seems your parents arrived yesterday and they've taken the presidential suite that was reserved under your name. They're saying there was a family emergency and they needed to use your booking immediately. I felt my stomach drop. Margaret and Harrison Chen, my new in-laws, had seemed supportive during our wedding planning, even insisting on paying for half the reception. But I'd noticed the way Margaret's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. The way she'd make little comments about my humble background as a public school teacher compared to their son's career as a corporate lawyer. I should probably start from the beginning. My name is Sarah Chen, and 3 days ago I married the man I thought was the love of my life. David and I had been together for 3 years, and despite his parents' obvious disapproval of our relationship, I'd convinced myself that love would conquer all. I was wrong. The first red flag should have been when Margaret insisted on helping plan our honeymoon. She'd gushed about how romantic the Serenity Bay Resort looked in the photos, how she and Harrison had always wanted to visit the Maldives themselves. You young people have such wonderful taste, she'd said, while carefully writing down every detail of our itinerary. At the time, I thought she was just being a caring mother-in-law. The second red flag was the way she'd handled our wedding guest list. Every time I'd suggest inviting one of my teacher friends or former colleagues, she'd find a reason why it wouldn't work. Oh, Sarah dear, we're already over budget with the venue. Or, I'm not sure your friends would feel comfortable at the country club. Slowly but surely, my side of the wedding became smaller and smaller while theirs grew. My parents, both hardworking immigrants who'd saved every penny to put me through college, looked so out of place among the Chen's wealthy social circle. But standing in that resort lobby, watching the concierge fumble with explanations, I realized this wasn't just disapproval. This was deliberate sabotage. There must be some mistake, David said, his voice rising. We've had this reservation for 8 months. We have confirmation emails, payment receipts, everything. The concierge, a kind-faced woman named Priya, nodded sympathetically. I understand your frustration, sir, but your parents presented the same documentation when they arrived. They claimed you'd asked them to come early to inspect the facilities. She paused, clearly uncomfortable. They mentioned something about the bride's family background and wanting to ensure the accommodations were appropriate. The humiliation burned through me like acid. Even here, thousands of miles from home, the Chens were making sure I knew my place. Where exactly are my parents now? David asked through gritted teeth. They're currently enjoying dinner at our exclusive oceanfront restaurant, the one that requires advance reservations. Priya glanced at her screen again. I'm afraid we're completely booked for the next 2 weeks due to the season, but I can offer you our standard garden view room at a discounted rate. I watched David's face crumble as the reality hit him. His parents hadn't just stolen our honeymoon destination, they'd humiliated us in front of the entire resort staff. The presidential suite we'd scrimped and saved for, the same suite where David had proposed, was now occupied by the two people who'd made it clear I'd never be good enough for their son. The garden view room will be fine, I said quietly, though inside I was seething. David looked at me with a mixture of guilt and helplessness, and for the first time since I'd said I do, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. What David and his parents didn't know was that I hadn't always been just a simple public school teacher. What they didn't know would change everything. What they didn't know was that before I became a teacher, I'd spent 5 years working as a hospitality consultant for luxury resort chains across Southeast Asia. I'd helped design guest experience protocols, trained staff in conflict resolution, and most importantly, I'd built relationships with resort managers from Singapore to Bali. The hospitality world was smaller than people realized, and reputation was everything. I also hadn't mentioned that my supposedly humble parents weren't just hardworking immigrants. My father had sold his successful tech company in Seoul before moving to America, and my mother had been a renowned chef who'd given up her Michelin-starred restaurant to raise me. They'd taught me to be humble about our wealth, to work for everything I wanted, and to never use money as a weapon. The Chens had mistaken my humility for poverty, and that was about to become their biggest mistake. As Priya led us to our garden view room, I caught sight of a familiar face behind the front desk. James Rodriguez had been the assistant manager at the Bali resort, where I'd implemented their new VIP guest program 3 years ago. He'd since been promoted and transferred here to the Maldives. When our eyes met, recognition flickered across his features. "Sarah Kim?" he called out, using my maiden name. "What are you doing here?" I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt since arriving. "It's Sarah Chen now, actually. I just got married. This is supposed to be my honeymoon." James glanced at David, then back at me, clearly sensing the tension. "Congratulations. You're staying in the garden view wing?" "Unfortunately, yes. There was a mix-up with our reservation." Understanding dawned in James's eyes. In the resort business, there were no such things as mix-ups. Only deliberate actions and their consequences. "I see. Well, let me personally ensure your stay is memorable." That night, while David tossed and turned beside me, clearly tormented by his parents' actions, I made some phone calls. My first call was to Priya, who I'd learned had been dealing with the Chen's increasingly demanding behavior since their arrival. They'd complained about everything from the thread count of their sheets to the temperature of their champagne, treating the staff like servants rather than professionals. "Mrs. Chen," Priya said carefully when I reached her on her personal line, "I want you to know that your in-laws' behavior has been challenging. They've made several inappropriate comments about the staff and have been quite rude to our housekeeping team." My second call was to my former colleague, Lisa Wang, who now worked as a regional director for the luxury hotel group that owned Serenity Bay. We'd maintained our friendship over the years, and she owed me a favor from when I'd helped her land a major client in Thailand. "Sarah, how's married life treating you?" Lisa's voice was warm through the international connection. "It's complicated. I need your help with something at the Serenity Bay Resort." By the time I explained the situation, Lisa was practically growling with anger. What? "Oh, honey, we don't tolerate guests who abuse our staff or humiliate other guests. Give me 12 hours. My third call was the most important one. I contacted Marcus Chen, David's estranged uncle who'd been quietly cut out of the family business years ago after a disagreement with Harrison. Marcus had always been kind to me, and I knew he'd been hurt by his exclusion from our wedding at Margaret's insistence. "Sarah, dear, how's the honeymoon going?" Marcus asked, though something in my voice must have alerted him that all wasn't well. "I think you should know what your brother and sister-in-law have done," I said, and proceeded to tell him everything. The silence on the other end was telling. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Harrison always was a bully, but this crosses every line. That resort, it's part of a chain I've been considering investing in. I think it's time I paid them a visit." The next morning, David woke up determined to confront his parents. I encouraged him, knowing that sometimes people needed to see the truth with their own eyes. We found Margaret and Harrison at the breakfast pavilion, occupying the best table with an unobstructed ocean view, while other guests were forced to wait. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk," David said, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. Margaret looked up from her Eggs Benedict with practiced innocence. "Oh, darling, there you are. Isn't this place magnificent? We're so glad we could experience it." "You stole our honeymoon," David said flatly. "You deliberately took our reservation and humiliated my wife." Harrison set down his coffee cup with the same cold precision he used in business meetings. "We didn't steal anything. We used a reservation that was paid for with money from the family trust. Money that, technically, belongs to all of us." The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. They'd never contributed a single dollar to our honeymoon savings. Besides, Margaret added, dabbing her lips with her napkin, we wanted to make sure this place was suitable before you brought Sarah here. Given her background, we thought it best to verify the standards ourselves. I watched David's face crumble as he realized this wasn't just about the room or the reservation. This was about his parents' fundamental belief that I wasn't good enough for their family, and their willingness to destroy our happiness to prove it. What my wife's background has to do with anything is beyond me, David said, but I could hear the defeat creeping into his voice. That's when James appeared at our table, impeccably dressed and carrying a leather portfolio. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Chen? He asked politely. Yes? Harrison replied, clearly expecting some form of VIP treatment. I'm James Rodriguez, the resort manager. I need to speak with you both privately about some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your stay with us. Margaret's smile faltered slightly. Concerns? I can't imagine what you mean. We're platinum members of your rewards program. James's smile remained professional, but I caught the steel underneath. Yes, ma'am. That's actually part of what we need to discuss. Within 20 minutes, Margaret and Harrison were escorted from the breakfast pavilion to James's office, leaving David and me sitting in stunned silence. Other guests had begun to stare, whispers rippling through the elegant dining area as the Chen's humiliation played out in full view. What just happened? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I sipped my coffee calmly, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as his parents gestured wildly in James's office. I think your parents are about to learn that actions have consequences. David stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Sarah, what did you do? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Lisa Wang. Check your email. The documentation you requested is ready. I excused myself and walked to the business center, where I printed several pages of official-looking documents. When I returned to our table, David was nervously shredding his napkin, his eyes fixed on his parents' increasingly animated conversation with James. I need to tell you something, I said, sliding the papers across the table. I wasn't entirely honest about my background when we first met. David looked down at the documents, his eyes widening as he read. The first page was my employment history with Meridian Hospitality Group, showing my role as senior consultant and my involvement in launching luxury resort protocols across 12 properties. The second page was a letter of recommendation from the CEO, praising my innovative guest experience strategies. The third was a certificate recognizing my contributions to hospitality excellence in the Asia-Pacific region. You were a resort consultant? David's voice was filled with confusion and something that might have been awe. For 5 years before I became a teacher, I helped design the very protocols your parents are probably violating right now. I gestured toward James's office, where Harrison was now standing, his face red with indignation. I also helped train most of the senior management staff in this resort chain. David set the papers down with shaking hands. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted you to love me for who I am now, not who I used to be. I became a teacher because I wanted to make a difference in children's lives, not because I couldn't do anything else. I paused, watching his parents through the window. But sometimes, when people push you far enough, you have to remind them that underestimating someone is dangerous. Just then, James emerged from his office, followed by Margaret and Harrison, both looking shell-shocked. They walked directly to our table, their earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Sarah, Margaret began, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. We owe you an apology. Actually, you don't, I replied evenly. You owe the housekeeping staff an apology for your racist comments. You owe the restaurant staff an apology for treating them like servants. You owe the concierge an apology for your condescending behavior. Harrison cleared his throat, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The resort manager has informed us that our membership privileges have been suspended pending a full review of our conduct. He also mentioned, Margaret added reluctantly, that complaints about our behavior have been filed with the corporate office. David looked between his parents and me, pieces clicking into place. The family emergency story? There was no emergency, Harrison admitted, unable to meet his son's eyes. We wanted to experience this place ourselves before you brought Sarah here. And? David's voice was dangerously quiet. And we thought if we could show you how out of place she was in settings like this, you might reconsider the marriage, Margaret whispered. The silence that followed was deafening. David stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. You sabotaged my honeymoon to prove my wife wasn't good enough for your standards? We were trying to protect you, Harrison protested weakly. From what? From happiness? From love? From a woman who's achieved more in her career than either of you ever did? David's voice carried across the dining area, causing other guests to openly stare. I stood and placed a gentle hand on David's arm. It's okay, I said softly. They've shown us exactly who they are. At that moment, Marcus Chen appeared in the dining area, looking immaculate in a tailored linen suit. He surveyed the scene with the shrewd eyes of a successful businessman, taking in his brother's defeated posture and Margaret's tear-stained face. Harrison, Margaret. His greeting was ice cold. I see you've met my new business partner. Business partner? Harrison's voice cracked. Marcus smiled, the expression sharp as a blade. Sarah didn't mention. She's agreed to consult on the hospitality protocols for my new resort acquisition. This resort, as it happens. He gestured broadly at the luxurious surroundings. Amazing what happens when you actually treat people with respect and recognize talent when you see it. Margaret sank into her chair as if her legs had given out. You're buying this resort? Bought it. Yesterday. The moment I heard how you'd treated Sarah and the staff here. Marcus turned to me with genuine warmth. Welcome to the family business, Sarah. I think you'll find we value competence over pedigree. I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was there. Thank you, Marcus. I look forward to working together. David stared at me in amazement. You're going back to hospitality consulting? Part-time. I love teaching, but I also love creating experiences that bring people joy. I looked pointedly at Margaret and Harrison. Real joy. Not the kind that comes from making others feel small. James approached our table once more, this time carrying a key card. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mr. and Mrs. David Chen, we've prepared the presidential suite for you. With compliments from the new management. As David and I walked toward the elevator, I could hear Margaret behind us, her voice desperate. David, please. We can work this out. We're family. David turned back, his expression sad but resolute. Family doesn't sabotage each other's happiness, Mom. Family supports each other, even when they don't understand the choices being made. The elevator doors closed on his parents' stricken faces, but I felt no satisfaction in their pain. I felt something better. I felt free. That evening, as David and I finally enjoyed the sunset dinner we'd planned on the private terrace of the presidential suite, he took my hand across the table. I'm sorry, he said simply, for not protecting you from them, for not seeing who they really were. You see them now, I replied. That's what matters. And I see you too. Really see you. He lifted my hand to his lips. My brilliant, accomplished, extraordinary wife. I smiled, watching the sun paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. So, ready for the rest of our honeymoon? David grinned, the first truly happy expression I'd seen from him since we'd arrived. With you? I'm ready for anything. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Meridian Hospitality Group's Singapore headquarters, presenting my comprehensive report on guest experience optimization across their Maldivian properties. The PowerPoint slides reflected months of meticulous work, transforming the Serenity Bay Resort into the crown jewel of their collection. Occupancy rates had increased by 37%, guest satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, and staff retention had improved dramatically after we implemented new dignity and respect protocols. Exceptional work, Sarah, declared CEO Amanda Foster, a woman I'd admired since my early consulting days. The board is unanimous in approving your proposal for the Pacific expansion. I smiled, thinking about how far I'd come since that humiliating day in the resort lobby. Teaching remained my passion, but this consulting work had reignited something in me I'd forgotten I possessed. The ability to create spaces where people felt valued, respected, and genuinely welcomed. Marcus Chen sat at the far end of the conference table, beaming with pride. His investment in the resort chain had proved incredibly lucrative. But more than that, our partnership had evolved into something neither of us had expected. He'd become the father figure I'd never had, and I'd become the daughter he'd never been able to have. "There is one more matter we need to discuss," Amanda continued, her expression growing serious. "We've received a formal complaint regarding the Serenity Bay property, specifically about discriminatory treatment and the revocation of platinum membership status for Harrison and Margaret Chen." I felt my stomach tighten, but Marcus held up a hand before I could speak. "Amanda, if I may," he said smoothly, "I believe you'll find that complaint has been thoroughly investigated by your legal team. The documentation of their behavior toward staff members, including recorded incidents of verbal abuse and discriminatory language, speaks for itself." Amanda nodded, flipping through a thick folder. "Indeed, the complaint has been dismissed. In fact, their behavior has been flagged across our entire network. They're no longer welcome at any Meridian property worldwide." The irony wasn't lost on me. Harrison and Margaret, who'd spent years defining their worth through exclusive memberships and elite status, had been permanently banned from the very world they'd tried to protect from my influence. After the meeting, Marcus and I walked through the bustling streets of Singapore's financial district. The afternoon heat was oppressive, but I felt lighter than I had in months. "Have you heard from David lately?" Marcus asked as we stopped at a hawker center for coffee. "Every day," I replied, stirring my kopi. "He's been working with a therapist, trying to understand how his parents' toxicity affected him. It's been difficult, but necessary." David and I had spent those 6 months rebuilding our relationship from the ground up. The honeymoon incident had exposed cracks in our foundation that we'd been ignoring for years. His tendency to avoid conflict, my habit of keeping secrets to protect others' feelings. We'd both realized that love alone wasn't enough without honest communication and mutual respect. "And teaching? You're not planning to give that up entirely?" "Never," I said firmly. "I'm designing a hospitality program for my high school students, teaching them that service isn't servitude, that creating joy for others is one of the most valuable skills anyone can possess." Marcus smiled. "Your parents would be proud. They always said you had a gift for bringing out the best in people." My parents had been overwhelmed when they learned about the resort acquisition and my new consulting role. They'd also been quietly satisfied when I told them about Margaret and Harrison's downfall. "Karma," my mother had said simply, "always finds its way." "Speaking of your parents," Marcus continued, "they're flying in for the grand reopening of the Bali property next month, aren't they? They wouldn't miss it. Dad's excited to see how we've incorporated sustainable technology into the resort operations." I paused, watching the organized chaos of the food vendors around us. It feels good having family who actually supports what I'm doing. The contrast between the two families couldn't have been starker. Where the senior Chens had tried to diminish and control, my parents and Marcus had encouraged and celebrated. Where Margaret and Harrison had seen threats to their status, my family saw opportunities for growth and connection. That evening, I video called David from my hotel room. He looked healthier than he had in months, the stress lines around his eyes finally starting to fade. "How did the presentation go?" he asked, settling back in his chair. I could see our apartment behind him, the walls now decorated with photos from our belated honeymoon adventures and my hospitality awards. "Better than expected. They're expanding the program to 12 more properties across the Pacific." "That's incredible, Sarah. I'm so proud of you. How are things with your parents?" It was a question I asked carefully now, knowing how much pain the subject still caused him. David sighed, running his hand through his hair. "Dad called again yesterday. He wants to meet for lunch, to discuss the situation, as he put it." "What did you tell him?" "The same thing I've told him for 6 months. That until they're willing to genuinely apologize to you, to the resort staff they mistreated, and to acknowledge that their behavior was wrong, we have nothing to discuss. I felt a surge of love for this man who'd finally learned to stand up for what was right, even when it meant standing against his own family. Mom's been reaching out to mutual friends, David continued, trying to get them to convince me that I'm being unreasonable. She's telling everyone that you've turned me against my family. What do your friends say? David smiled ruefully. The ones worth keeping? They ask why it took me so long to see the truth. The others? Well, I'm learning that some friendships were built on shared social status rather than genuine connection. It was painful but necessary growth. David was discovering who he was outside of his parents' influence, outside of their money and social connections. The man emerging from that process was someone I'd fallen in love with all over again. I have news, I said, unable to contain my excitement any longer. Amanda offered me the position of regional director for Southeast Asia. David's face lit up. Sarah, that's amazing. Are you going to take it? I want to discuss it with you first. It would mean splitting time between Singapore and Los Angeles, managing a team of consultants across 8 countries. We'll make it work, David said without hesitation. Whatever you want to do, wherever you want to go, I'm with you. I smiled, remembering the scared young woman who'd stood in that resort lobby 6 months ago, convinced that her marriage was over before it had truly begun. That woman had been afraid of her own power, afraid of outshining others, afraid of being too much. The woman I'd become embraced every bit of her strength and used it to lift others up. Margaret and Harrison had tried to clip my wings, but instead, they'd taught me how to soar. 2 years later, I stood at the helm of the newly renovated Serenity Bay Resort, watching as the staff prepared for our most important event yet. The annual Meridian Hospitality Excellence Awards were being held here tonight, with industry leaders from around the world gathering to celebrate innovation in guest experience. The irony that this celebration was taking place at the very resort where Margaret and Harrison had tried to humiliate me wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. The resort had been transformed beyond recognition under my leadership. Where once there had been rigid hierarchies and cold formality, we'd created an environment where genuine warmth and authentic connection flourished. Our staff turnover rate was the lowest in the industry, guest satisfaction scores consistently broke company records, and we'd become the gold standard for inclusive luxury hospitality. David walked up behind me, adjusting his tie as he prepared for the evening's festivities. He looked confident and relaxed in a way I'd never seen during his years under his parents' shadow. After 18 months of therapy and some difficult conversations, he'd finally found his own path. He'd left his father's law firm and started a practice focused on employment rights and workplace discrimination. His first major case had been representing resort workers who'd faced mistreatment at competing hotels. The photographer wants to get some shots of us before the guests arrive, he said, wrapping his arms around my waist as we looked out at the pristine beach where the awards ceremony would take place. In a minute, I said, savoring this moment of calm before the celebration began. I want to remember this feeling. Tonight wasn't just about professional recognition, though that was certainly meaningful. I was receiving the Meridian Lifetime Achievement Award for Innovation in Hospitality at the age of 31, the youngest recipient in the company's history. But more than that, tonight represented the complete transformation of my life from someone who hid her light to protect others' feelings to someone who used her brilliance to illuminate opportunities for everyone around her. My phone buzzed with a message from my assistant. The Chen party has arrived and is requesting to speak with you. I showed the message to David, whose jaw tightened slightly. We'd known this moment would come eventually. Harrison and Margaret had been making increasingly desperate attempts to reconcile over the past year, especially after David's new law practice had begun making headlines for its groundbreaking victories against workplace discrimination. Do you want me to handle this? David asked, his protective instincts still strong after all this time. No, I said calmly. It's time we finished this properly. We walked through the resort's elegant corridors, past the walls displaying photos of our staff awards, community outreach programs, and sustainable tourism initiatives. Every image told the story of what happened when you invested in people's dignity rather than exploiting their desperation. Harrison and Margaret were waiting in the lobby, looking remarkably smaller than I remembered. 2 years of social exile had taken its toll. Harrison's perpetually confident bearing had been replaced by an uncertain nervousness, while Margaret's designer clothes couldn't quite hide the fact that she'd aged considerably. The country club crowd they'd once ruled had moved on without them, their racist comments and entitled behavior making them liabilities in an increasingly conscious world. "Sarah," Margaret began, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "Thank you for agreeing to see us." "I didn't agree to anything," I replied evenly. "You're guests at a public event. I'm simply being professional." Harrison stepped forward, holding an envelope. "We wanted to personally deliver this invitation to you and David." I opened it to find an elaborately designed card announcing the renewal of their wedding vows, celebrating 30 years of marriage. The timing wasn't coincidental. They knew about tonight's awards ceremony, knew that photographers and industry journalists would be documenting every moment. "We'd like you both to be there," Margaret said, her eyes pleading. "As family." David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Family? You threw my wife out of a resort lobby while trying to sabotage our honeymoon. You made racist comments about the staff. You spent 3 years treating Sarah like she was beneath your notice." "We made mistakes," Harrison said, the admission clearly painful for him. "We've learned from them." "Have you?" I asked quietly. "Because from what I understand, you've spent the last 2 years telling anyone who'll listen that I manipulated David away from his family using money and connections." Margaret's face flushed red. "That's not, we never said." "Mrs. Patterson from the country club, Dr. Williams from your former social circle, the Maître de Le Bernardin where you used to have your anniversary dinners." I listed them calmly, watching their expressions change. "Did you think word wouldn't get back to me? The hospitality industry is smaller than you imagine, and people talk." David stared at his parents with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "You've been spreading lies about my wife for 2 years while pretending you want to reconcile?" "We were hurt," Margaret said defensively. "We lost our son, our reputation, everything we'd built." "You lost those things because of your own choices," I replied firmly. "I didn't destroy your reputation. I didn't isolate you from your social circle. I didn't make you treat people with cruelty and disrespect. You did all of that yourselves." Harrison's composure finally cracked. "You turned our son against us. You used your connections to destroy our standing in the community." "I protected myself and the people around me from your toxicity," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I used my skills and connections to build something positive while you used yours to tear others down." Just then, Amanda Foster approached our group, flanked by 2 security officers. She'd been watching from across the lobby, and her expression was thunderous. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Chen," she said formally. "I believe you were informed that you're banned from all Meridian properties. This constitutes trespassing." Margaret's face went white. "We're here for our son. Surely there's some exception for family events." "Your son is here as Sarah's guest," Amanda replied coldly. "You are not invited, you're not welcome, and you need to leave immediately." As security began to escort them out, Harrison turned back one last time. "This isn't over, Sarah. We won't let you poison our son against us forever." David stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby. "Dad, stop. Just stop. Sarah didn't poison me against you. You did that yourselves the moment you chose cruelty over kindness, judgment over acceptance, and pride over love." He paused, looking at his parents with something that might have been pity. "I hope someday you understand that the family you claim to be protecting was never really a family at all. It was just a performance designed to maintain your social status." As the doors closed behind his parents, David took my hand. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that tonight of all nights." "Actually," I said, surprising myself with how genuinely I meant it, "I'm glad it happened. I needed to see them one more time to realize that they can't hurt me anymore. They have no power over the life we've built." The awards ceremony that evening was magical. As I accepted my award on the beach where David had first proposed, Looking out at an audience filled with colleagues, friends, and industry leaders who respected my work, I felt the final pieces of my old insecurities fall away. Marcus Chen, now my official business partner and the closest thing to a father I'd ever known, introduced me with words that brought tears to my eyes. My parents sat in the front row, beaming with pride at their daughter who'd learned to embrace her strength rather than hide it. David's genuine smile as he applauded told me everything I needed to know about the man I'd chosen to build a life with. During my acceptance speech, I spoke about the importance of creating spaces where everyone feels valued, where dignity isn't a luxury but a baseline expectation. I talked about the power of seeing potential in others, even when they can't see it in themselves. I didn't mention the Chens by name, but everyone in the industry knew the story. They knew that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction but transformation, not tearing others down but building something so beautiful that their negativity becomes irrelevant. As the evening wound down and guests began to disperse, David and I walked hand in hand along the beach where our nightmare had begun, and our real love story had started. "No regrets?" he asked, squeezing my hand. I looked back at the resort glowing with warm light, filled with people who'd been touched by the programs we'd created, the standards we'd established, and the culture of respect we'd fostered. I thought about the dozens of young hospitality workers who'd been promoted under my leadership, the sustainable tourism initiatives that were protecting this beautiful environment, and the scholarship program I'd established for underprivileged students interested in hospitality careers. "None," I said firmly. "They tried to make me smaller, and instead I became everything I was meant to be." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.